joining us today. We'll still have, we had quite a good registration for this, so we'll probably still have folks joining us, excuse me, as we start. I won't keep us much longer, but for those of you who, I know this email went out to not just the Business Development Committee, but the key contact partners and the marketing and business development professionals within our firm. So we do, VN, have a mix of lawyers and the BD professionals who actually work with the lawyers on their submissions today. And we have a really great crowd. Everyone, before we kick off, VN will take a moment to pause between sections of his presentation. If you do have a question, just go ahead and use the raise hand feature and we'll call on you, or if you prefer to drop your questions in the chat. I did share with Yen a list of questions that we had from the February meeting that we had put together, and I know more have come up. I've received a few via email. I know Inez has a few, but if you do have additional questions, we do want you to feel like you can ask those in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. Ignacio, did you have anything to add before we turn it over to the end?
Thank you, Hannah. Just say hello to everybody. And as discussed last February, the chamber submission is key for every law firm throughout the world. And I would like to thank Vian for being here and give us some insight on the research process. With that, I think we can start.
Sure.
Wonderful. Well, Vian, take it away, please.
Thank you, Hannah. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're based. As Hannah mentioned, I'm Vian, and I am in charge of our global international capabilities research. So I focus on the global guide and the international and cross-border tables that that guide covers. So I'm here today to essentially give a how-to presentation in terms of best practice when it comes to mainly the submission and references. So as Hannah mentioned, there'll be plenty of opportunities for questions. So I'll stop after the two main segments, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end to cover any questions you might have. So let me just share my screen so you can see the presentation. Can everyone see that on your ends? Okay, great. So as I mentioned, this presentation is in connection to our submissions, referees, our research principles in general, and I'll be focusing on those two former aspects in the call. So in terms of a brief introduction, I'm sure you're all aware of the chambers and what we do, but in case you aren't, we're essentially the industry's or the legal industry's leading directory company. So to that end, we essentially rank and recognize the best law firms and lawyers across the globe. To many in the industry, we're seen as the gold standard, and that's off the back of our research, our in-depth research. So in terms of the team as a whole, we have 200 plus researchers across all our guides, and those researchers conduct over 200,000 interviews and surveys each year to come to our set of rankings. And it's really the depth and breadth of our research which distinguishes us from the market. So to that end, I know a Chambers ranking for many is seen as the ranking to have. So hopefully after this presentation, you'll be a bit more clued up as to some of the things you can do when it comes to getting a potential ranking. So moving on to the research process, I know it can seem a bit unclear as to how we do things here at Chambers and what we look into. So I'll address that in this slide. So in terms of our rankings, there are three key things that we look into. The work highlights that are covered in the submission, the feedback from clients. So these are essentially the clients of the law firms and the individual practitioners, and the commentary or the market commentary the firm receives. So that's essentially the profile the firm has within the wider market. So in terms of the submission, for those that aren't aware, this is essentially a document that highlights the firm's work in a given practice area. So the document is broadly split up into two categories. The first section focuses on the firm, key individuals, unique selling points, or what the firm is best known for, and a section for the firm to provide some feedback on our rankings and highlight its clients too. The second part of the submission is essentially the work highlights. We allow firms to submit up to 20 examples of work it's undertaking in a given practice area, and those are split up in between between confidential and non-confidential matters. So that's the submission. Moving on to client feedback. This is perhaps the biggest pillar of a chamber's ranking, and it essentially revolves around speaking to the clients and hearing about their perspective when it comes to working with these firms and individuals. So in terms of our practice areas, most of our sections have or allow up to 20 referees per firm per practice area. For certain practice areas in the USA guide and the Canada guide, we do allow up to 30 referees. And I know going forward, that might be a number that's used going forward across all of our guides. So at the moment it's 20, but some guides do have 30. So do check in with your local guide to see what the limit is there. And in terms of collecting feedback and arranging calls, we will initially reach out to the clients via email. And after that, the researcher will either arrange a call to speak to the client or send a link to the survey where the client can fill in or share their thoughts on the practice and individuals. In some cases, clients have multiple referrals. So that's not just practice areas, but firms as well. So in that instance, we'll just do the one interview, and that one interview will cover all the referrals across the board for all firms and practice areas. Moving on, the third element of our research is the market commentary. So as I mentioned, that's essentially the profile the firm has amongst its peers in the market. So when it comes to the research, we also arrange calls with practitioners and law firms. The first part of the call focuses on the firm itself. So it's a chance to elaborate on the work highlights, some of the key developments and trends over the last year or so, perhaps new members on the team or promotions and so on. And the second part focuses on our rankings and the firm or practitioner's thoughts on other firms in the field. So those are the some of the factors that we take into account when it comes to
wonderful, Des.
Moving on to our submission. So I'll talk a bit about some of the best practice tips when it comes to filling out the submission. The first is essentially to use our template. You can find our template on our website, and we have various templates for various guides. But I can't reiterate this enough. Please do use the templates. Some firms tend to use their own template, and we find that the content can be hard to read sometimes, and it's not really great on the eye. So if you can, please do use our own template. As I say, you can find that on the website, and do fill it in properly. There have been many instances where firms have just filled in the first part of the submission, so they've highlighted key individuals but haven't actually highlighted any of the work highlights. From our perspective, that's quite useless really, because the main aspect of the submission is the work highlights. So do fill it in completely. It's relatively self-explanatory, but if you do have any specific questions whilst you're filling it in, you can reach out to the relevant research manager on the relevant team, and they'll be more than happy to advise accordingly. The second thing to consider is the type of work highlights that you're putting in. So often is the case, we see firms including work highlights that aren't relevant to the practice area that they're uploading to. So for example, in an M&A section, we would like to see transactions, acquisitions, dispositions, joint ventures, mergers, and so on. We wouldn't expect to see, say, tax matters or labor employment matters or disputes and so on. So with regards to that, you can find the definitions of the various practice areas on our website. And again, if you have any specific questions with regards to what's relevant in a specific practice area and what isn't, please do reach out to the relevant team member and they will be able to advise accordingly. Next, we've got clear and concise write-ups. So to that end, more is less from our perspective when it comes to writing up the work highlights. The more clear, or sorry, the more concise the write-ups are, the better, since the researcher will be analyzing a number of submissions. So if the firm can get to the point as quickly as possible, that's great. In many instances, we see firms writing reams and reams and paragraphs of information that isn't always necessary or applicable. I'd advise you to not do that, essentially. So you can, I've got an example of a work highlight coming up, but in terms of concise write-up, you can write one summary line to start off with, and then add a few bullet points as to some of the significant elements of the matter, and then round off with why you think the why you think this matter is particularly important. That goes on to my next point about significance. So it's always good to emphasize why a matter is particularly important for the firm. It could be a matter for a new client, or a particularly high value transaction on behalf of a client, or perhaps a deal for a client in a new jurisdiction. So do indicate to us why you feel that this matter is significant and why it should add weight to a ranking there. And that goes for value as well. So for many of our practice areas, the value of matter, especially for our transactional practice areas, the value of a matter plays a big part as to how important the matter is. So do highlight numbers and values when it comes to these transactional matters. In terms of the individuals to highlight, it's always good to include a mix of lawyers across the board. As an example, you can include some of the more junior partners as well, include their highlights, as well as the established partners and senior partners. We do have instances where a firm will highlight one specific lawyer across the 20 matters, and that's great for that specific lawyer. But in terms of highlighting the bench strength of the practice, which is something that we look into when it comes to a ranking, that's not great. So do highlight as many practitioners as you can in this specific practice area to showcase the bench strength of the team there. Next, we've got recent matters. So from our perspective, and it does vary a bit by guide, you should include matters that have been done in the last 12 months or so. So any further than that, or any older than that, it's not great to include those matters. There is a bit of flexibility, as we know that, for example, disputes and litigations can go on for a long time. But when it comes to, say, transactional matters, they should have been done over the last year or so. Finally, we've got the number of matters. So we allow a maximum of 20 matters in the submission. So please do utilize the full 20 if you can. And they're split up between confidential and non-confidential highlights. So that's purely for our editorial purposes. So you can, well, in the template, they're split up into 10 of each, but you can amend that. So if you have, say, 20 confidential highlights, feel free to include 20 there and not include any publishable ones, or vice versa. So moving on to an example work highlight, hopefully you can see that on my screen. It might be a bit small, but I'll talk you through it. So from my perspective, this is essentially a perfect work highlight. So there we go. In D1, we've got the name of the client, Corporation Inc. Sorry.
Ian, is there a possibility that you could maybe share that in the chat? I can't see that text on my screen. So I imagine others can't see it very well either. It's very small.
Okay, let me, okay, what I'll do, I'll come back to this then. I'll take a screenshot of this from the presentation and then just follow up. But yes,
thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, I'll come back to this, but yes, so that's the submission side of it. And Before I move on to the referees, probably a good point to answer any questions with regards to the submission. So Hannah, did you have any on your end at all?
So I think, you know, one of the questions that I got from a couple of folks over email the last couple of days, you know, you talk about writing these clear and concise write-ups and highlighting as many lawyers as possible. How is that different for big and small firms? So in World Law Group, we do have a mix of firms that are larger and firms that are smaller. And, you know, one of our larger firms made the comment to me the other day that they're basically getting the same amount of real estate as a smaller firm, and they're able to highlight more of their lawyers and more of their matters in the same amount of real estate as a firm that does a lot more, a higher volume of work. So is there anything, you know, is there anything those bigger firms can do to really showcase themselves, knowing that they have the same amount of real estate as somebody that's a smaller firm that's also getting sort of equal weight in rankings in the review process?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I do appreciate for a larger practice, 20 work highlights perhaps isn't the most. So to that end, that really affects the practitioners in question. So from my perspective, if there's an individual that's been band 1 for a long time, we'll know about this person, we'll know about their reputation in the market, and we'll know about the work that they're doing. So you can replace some of their work highlights with perhaps a more up and coming practitioner. As you know, we have the U ranking, which is essentially a ranking that we give to partners who are less than 7 years in the partnership, and essentially individuals that are making a name for themselves in the field. So you can allocate the real estate accordingly. That's one thing I advise firms to do. So it also applies to senior statespeople as well, and practitioners that are perhaps towards the twilight of their career compared to others. I would suggest including less of those or their highlights and replacing their highlights with the highlights of more up and coming practitioners, or perhaps practitioners that you want to focus on in terms of moving up a tier or a ranking, or moving up a band in the ranking. So perhaps if there's an individual that you want to focus on in terms of moving up from band 4 to 3, I'd advise you to include their highlights as opposed to, say, a senior statesperson. But yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that. It's not the easiest thing to balance, and from our end, we're certainly looking to see how we can make that better for firms. So it might be the case that in future submissions we'll basically open it up to more than 20 highlights, perhaps 30. But in terms of that, essentially watch the space, and we'll obviously let you know if that occurs. But hopefully that's answered your question, Hannah.
Yeah, and just sort of following up on that, important that he notes, you know, really highlighting some of those up and coming practitioners. Not to say that, you know, I don't want to put words in BN's mouth, not to say that if you've been ranked for years and, you know, you're on the rankings, you're quote unquote safe, but they've got that intel about you already. And so I think that, you know, one of the traps that some firms fall into is continuing to highlight the same folks over and over and over again, just because they're the head of the practice or they worked on all the deals or whatnot. But it's important to give real estate to those up and coming to get more of your lawyers ranked. Does anybody else have any other questions before he moves on?
Yes, me, Hannah, please. Hi, Bian. Thank you for your presentation today. I'm Ines Lucena from Brochu and Funes de Rioja in Argentina, and I'm responsible for the preparation of all the legal publications. So you were talking about the importance of the matter value involved. And my question to you is, apart from that, and I understand that you also value cross-border work matters, but is the role of the firm in a specific transaction duly weighed by chambers? Because sometimes we see law firms including deals in which maybe they participated in a minor role, maybe in capital markets and banking. Sometimes when you're on the side or you're advising a creditor, maybe you have the leading role in that specific transaction, and maybe some other participants just have to analyze one or two clauses. And it's not the same, the role that a specific firm addressed in that transaction than others. So is that role duly weighed by chambers?
Yes, absolutely. So when it comes to the work highlights, we'll look at what aspects the firm played in the role. So you're right, absolutely right. Some perhaps more niche firms will focus on a certain element of a deal, say, or a certain aspect of the matter, whilst other firms, maybe larger firms, will focus on the matter in its entirety. So to that end, it's important to highlight what role the firm played. So in my example, there was a line that said this law firm this law firm worked on the full scope of the matter, including antitrust, M&A, and tax matters. So in the actual work highlight blurb, do highlight the various teams that worked on the matter, as well as the section where you can highlight individuals as well. So with regards to that, in brackets, you can put the practice area that they focused on, as well as their location. But yes, some firms do try to sort of pull the wool over our eyes and make it seem that they worked on a massive multi-billion-dollar deal where actually they just worked on one element, and we will definitely keep a keen eye out for that. So as long as it's highlighted accordingly in the submission, that should be fine. We will analyze it accordingly.
Thanks, Inez. I think you can go ahead and continue the end. I don't see any hands raised.
Sure. Okay, let me share my screen again. Okay, so that was submissions. So I'll now move on to the references. And yes, sorry, my screen just paused there for a second. But I'll talk a bit about who to put forward and some other things to do. So in terms of deciding who to put forward, the first thing to consider is individuals that have worked with the practice recently and that can wax lyrical essentially about the practice and the practitioners in the team. So in some instances, we receive references and they're not too keen to speak to us, but consider that when you're putting the spreadsheet together. We'd love to hear to individuals that are really keen to speak to us. That also ties in with the next point about availability. So from our perspective, as the saying goes, availability is the best ability. So consider whether the individual in question will be available to speak to us given our time frame. So I'll give you an example. Often CEOs are put through on the reference list, and in some instances they might be too busy to speak to us, especially if the section is researched over a shorter period of time, say 2 or 3 weeks. So to that end, you might want to consider replacing them with another individual at the company that will be able to speak to us, who has much more availability and can attest to the strengths of the team and the individuals in question. In terms of the mix of clients, I think, well, from my perspective anyway, it's good to include a good mix of clients. So obviously the firms will have institutional clients, so you're more than welcome to include them in the reference spreadsheet. But it's also good to include new clients, especially clients that the practice or the firm have won over the last 12, 18 months or so. And that really points to the fact that the firm is winning new clients, and that's certainly something that we look into. So a good mix of old and new clients is most certainly welcome in the spreadsheet. And in connection to the spreadsheet and the submission, it's always good to link the referees to the work highlights. So, for example, if you put a multi-billion-dollar transaction in the submission as matter number 1, it'd be good to get someone from that client to speak to us. So include the relevant clients as they relate to the work highlights in the submission. Finally, the referees should mainly be clients, but we do accept other peers or other lawyers, such as perhaps co-counsel on a deal or on a dispute and so on. So also consider that, especially if the if the practice as a whole is perhaps lacking in terms of market recognition. So that's another avenue that the firm can consider in terms of bumping up the recognition it receives from the wider market. A couple of other points. In terms of the reference list, please do ask the references before you do put them down. There's been many instances where referees have got back to us saying they weren't aware that they were put down as a reference and they're not going to provide feedback. So we found that as long as the referees are aware of the fact that they're down on the spreadsheet, then that sort of simplifies the process and makes it more efficient. And to that end, also give them a heads up that we'll be in touch with them and that they'll receive an email from us. So with respect to that, you can find our schedule on our website, and you can get in touch with the relevant research manager or the head of to find out when the research will start. And just before the research does start, you can give the clients a quick heads up to say, hey, someone from Chambers will be in touch with you to hear about your thoughts on the firm. Just keep an eye out for the email from them. Response rates is also something to consider. You can consider purchasing Chambers referee management tool, which is essentially a dashboard that showcases in real time the level of responses, who's responded, who's yet to respond, and so on. Failing that, you could also just check in with the researcher during the halfway stage of the research to gauge how many have provided feedback or how many have shared their thoughts. And if the level of responses is low, you can follow up with them just to remind them about our email and the fact that we're keen to hear from them about the practice. Finally, in terms of our contact, not often, but sometimes the emails do end up in the spam inbox or junk inbox. So if the client hasn't received the email from us, do let us know. Do get in touch with the researcher or the research manager and let them know that XYZ hasn't received the email. Can you send it out again? And we'd be more than happy to do that. So that's certainly something to also keep an eye on as the research goes on. I've got some FAQs that I'll get onto shortly, but also happy to address any questions about the referees at this point. So I'll just stop sharing my screen. And Hannah, perhaps if I hand it over to you. Are there any questions with regards to the referees?
Perfect. Yeah, I know one of the ones that that we've talked about are sort of the you talked about matching up the referees to the sample matters that you're including, right? Which makes sense. What about the actual referee from those clients themselves? I think there's probably a tendency for some of these folks to, go to the general counsel, who's probably being asked by 15 other firms, that they work with. So what would you say when it comes to actually picking the referees within those clients that you're asking? Does it have to be general counsel? Could it be somebody that's on their team that just knows the matter inside and out? And then that's part one of the question. And then part two, how are those managed when 15 other firms are putting down the same referee? I just sort of want to give the audience sort of the big picture about what it looks like with that.
Sure. So in terms of the first point as to whether it should be general counsel, and that goes back to my point about availability. Whoever's best placed to talk about the matter. So if it's someone else in the team who knows the firm inside out, who's been working with the firm on a day-to-day basis, that's absolutely fine to put them down instead of the GC. So yeah, no issues with that. And yes, we do have many clients who we call super clients in-house. So these are individuals that might have 20, 30, 40 referrals across the board. So when it comes to those referrals, we will essentially tag the information. So let me backtrack a bit. With regards to those referrals, we'll always offer them a call as opposed to a survey. So that gives us the opportunity to speak at depth about the various referrals. We will get as much information as we can about all the referrals, but I appreciate that sometimes we can't always cover everything in one call. So we will then follow up that call with a call at a later date to address any remaining referrals. But yeah, we do have a process to deal with those super clients, as it were, and we allocate the feedback accordingly on our end, so that essentially none of the referrals are missed out and that we've got all bases covered.
Great. Ignacio, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks, Hannah. One follow-up question on that, Vian. It happens that the submissions for different practices are due on different dates. So it may happen that we include a referee from a certain practice area, like let's say disputes, and then that same referee appears in the submission by banking and capital markets or M&A. And how do you cope with that situation? Because I imagine that you are not contacting every referee 3 times a year, and you don't know what it's going to be called again.
Yes, exactly. So we used to have a 3-month rule, as it were. So we wouldn't contact the referrals more than within 3 months if they've already been contacted. But it's more of an ad hoc basis now. So to that extent, if they've already provided feedback, we'll probably wait a little bit and then recontact them towards the end of the research period. But we'll certainly still take on board their feedback. If it's the case where they've provided feedback before they were uploaded to the referee spreadsheet, we will also apply that feedback to the forthcoming section. So for example, if they shared thoughts on banking and finance, and it turns out that feedback is also applicable to M&A or wider teams, the tax, for example, we will also allocate that feedback for those additional sections as well.
Paula, I see that you have your hand up.
Thank you so much. Yes, I do have 2 different questions regarding referees. The first one is, well, it was actually put out by Ignacio, but is there a way we can know that a referee has been contacted before? I know that there's a confidentiality policy regarding this, so chambers cannot disclose probably what are referees that were contacted, and if they were, they're not going to be contacted again. So I think probably we're using that choices poorly because we don't have access to that information. And also we did purchase the referee management tool, but sometimes the information does not match. I mean, sometimes we go thoroughly through our clients, and our clients they say, okay, we did answer the survey, we did contact the investigator, but this information does not reflect in the referee management tool. And once we actually get in touch with our local investigator, he says, okay, probably the best way to go is that you guys contact the service or the contact service support with regards to the referee management tool, but it never matches. So it's something that's a bit concerning for us.
Yeah, that is a bit concerning to hear. So if that's the case, you should let the research manager know and the researcher know. As far as I'm aware, it should be up to date. But we are, sometimes we do have bugs and glitches. So we do have a team that's working on that consistently to make sure that's as efficient as possible and that's displaying the correct answer. But if there are any instances where the feedback or where the information doesn't match up on your end, do let us know, and we'll look into that and essentially look into it manually as well to provide you a manual response when it comes to the referees and so on. In terms of knowing whether a referee's already been contacted, I'm afraid there isn't a way to essentially find that out. But like I say, we are moving to a system where we're more flexible about contacting referees. So if you do have any particular concerns with a referee that hasn't, or you feel that hasn't been contacted, regardless of the RMT or not, you can just reach out to the researcher or the research manager, let them know, and they'll be more than happy to reach out to that specific referee.
Ignacio, I see you've got your hand up again.
No, let Daniela go ahead, please, and I will ask my question later because you haven't participated yet.
Hello, hi. Thank you, Jan and the World Local for organising this call. I think everybody that is involved in the process knows that it's a bit of a love and hate situation. maybe more on the hate side than the love, but it's a very a time-consuming a process, and knowing there isn't like an exact science that you say, you put on 3 referees and you go off a band, you put 5 referees, you get 10. And it is obviously quite challenging for, and I think that also plays with the larger firms versus the smaller ones. It's quite challenging for the larger firms to put up it's like enough referees for all of the partners. And at times we at PLMJ, we purchase the insight reports as well, on top of the referee management tool. So, and on the insight reports, at times we feel like we go a little bit on a loop, right? So they say, you have to show the bench strength, and then we show more partners and send more referee for more partners, and that will inevitably reduce the number of referees and matters we have for individual partners, right? And then the following insight report will say, partner A now shows less level of activity, and you're like, wow, you have to make up your mind. You either want us to show more partners and more matters and send more referees from more people, or we keep on sending more. And even the situation that you have mentioned for those very long-standing band ones, and we did use that strategy to for a very large practice, whereby we reduced the number of matters that this particular partner had to be able to get others. It worked for getting other partners ranked, but he was downgraded a band 2. So again, going back to the point that we know is not an exact science, at times, and because we've been engaged with Chamber for such a long time, and we do buy the reports, it's difficult to get a strategy that is bulletproof, because we go around, kind of trying to showcase everybody, and then that negatively impacts a partner or another lawyer individually, and we don't quite know. So, what do you consider that it should be the minimum number of referees, and what highlights that an individual partner should have if we want their partner to, get ranked or go up? And what would be the bare minimum for, one of those more established partners on band 1, or on those kind of senior statement eminent practitioner type of role? And then the second question will be, so you're saying that the Chamber no longer has the 3 months rule. There used to be 6. So you no longer have that at all. And the people, if we put someone for corporate M&A and 3 months down the line to real estate, they are going to be contacted, or Chamber is going to decide if they're going to be contacted? Because that, not having the 3 months rule is great, but having a rule whereby Chamber decides if they're going to be contacted or not, then that becomes very difficult for us to understand. Because I can work with the 3 months rule, but it's very difficult to work with not having anything at all. And the last question, I promise I'll shut up, is this saying that we should contact the research manager, letting them know that our contact didn't receive the email. We do that very often, because unfortunately very often the emails don't get delivered. But our understanding so far, and the researchers are all great and available, is not that they don't do individual, I'm going to write an email to this one person. It's whenever the follow-up is scheduled to be sent out, then it will be sent out. But if someone didn't receive the first email from Chambers because of a technical issue on the first email, definitely not going to receive the follow-up either. So if you could expand on this idea of you having more flexibility and us being able to reach out to the researchers, letting them know that a particular referee didn't receive and what's happened. Because my understanding, if that's sent by your system and someone didn't receive it the first time, they're not going to receive the first time. Even at PLMJ, Chamber's emails do stuck on the spine, and I have to ask IT to liberate them. So I understand that happens to the clients, and that has to do with the domain, and it's not going to change if it's the first time or the second.
Yes, no, certainly it's an important question. So from my perspective, for example, if there's an issue with the email address, I'll ask my researcher to cold call the client and leave a message, and then use that as a mechanism to either get a call organized, or perhaps find a personal email address as well where they can send a survey link. So we do have ways around that, which often involves essentially cold calling. So if you do let the research managers know, they should be able to facilitate that on their end. In terms of the 3-month rule, so it varies guide by guide. So from my perspective, I don't have a 3-month rule. I know the US team and Canada team, they're a lot more flexible there as well. And I appreciate it's difficult when you're putting through referees for multiple sections that are being researched at the same time. What I'd suggest doing is getting in touch with the local guide to see where they stand on it. Our mantra is that we're essentially being more flexible these days, because we appreciate that the firms put in a lot of effort into these submissions and referees, and we're essentially asking more from the firms. So get in touch with the local guides, and they'll be able to advise on the best course of action with regards to that. I know I was on the USA team for several years, and I know they're very flexible when it comes to reaching out to referees that have already been reached out to, say, in the last month or so. And so that would be my advice there. And in terms of bare minimum, when it comes to work highlights and referees, again, there's no exact science there, and it varies depending on the nature of the section. So for example, we've got sections where they're quite small and firms don't tend to submit, or we don't get much feedback there. So with regards to those sections, one highlight and one comment from a market source or client may be enough to get a ranking. On the flip side, if it's a table such as New York M&A, where everyone wants to be ranked in band 1 in that table, that would not be enough. So it's essentially dependent on the section. Again, I would suggest getting in touch with the relevant research manager to get a better flavor as to which direction to go towards, because I appreciate it's very difficult on your end to get the balance right, and it can be quite frustrating to see, okay, well, we focused on this person in the referees and the submission, but it hasn't resulted in the ranking, and that could be because of other factors. So that might be because they're not necessarily getting the market recognition from the rest of the market, which might be hindering them. So in that respect, you could always think about putting in peers as referrals going forward. So in short, there's no exact science, but do get in touch with the relevant guide, and they'll be able to advise you a bit more as to what would work best for certain tables. Okay.
Ignacio, thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Last February, we held an open discussion among the group, and we shared some experiences with the submissions and with the interviews and with the contact with the referees. And one thing that arose was that for certain practices in certain regions, the researcher has been the same for, I don't know, 10 years or more. And in other jurisdictions, and that is my case, for instance, the researcher has changed many times, and it feels like every year we have to explain the Argentine market to the researcher, and you feel that he or she might not have the full picture year by year of what's going on in Argentina and what each law firm does in each type of practice. How do you cope with that in order to, keep a level playing field with that?
Sure, absolutely. So you're quite right. As with any company, we do have turnover. So when a researcher leaves, or when a new researcher is assigned to a section, that's where the research managers come to the fore. So they'll oversee the sections, and they'll have a greater understanding of the historic nature of the sections, which firms have tended to do well, which firms have perhaps not done as well recently, and they'll obviously relay that information to the researcher or a new researcher taking over the section. So it's essentially, from our part, the research manager is a sort of quality assurance agent when it comes to these sections, and they'll be the individuals that act as this focus point, and they will make sure that the researchers, one, know exactly what they're looking for in these sections when it comes to the work highlights and commentary, and two, make sure that they know the sort of backstory of the tables in question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Maria.
Hi, everyone. Just two things. The first one is that, like someone said before, we also did purchase the referee management tool, and we didn't have a good experience with that. We had a lot of problems because sometimes the information didn't match, and what the researcher says was not what the tool was saying, and we really have many problems. We spoke to the support team, but we honestly also didn't have a good answer to all of our questions. So we really expect that this year this change for good. And the other thing that was really my question was, does Chambers receive information from the firms, like, for example, I don't know, press releases or relevant information about the firm that we think it's good for them to know? Or is the submissions the only way to send Chambers this information?
Yes, so in terms of that question, the submission isn't the only way to send information. So obviously we appreciate that there will be updates to cases, and there'll be new matters that the firm has won, if you will. So if that's the case, you can send over the press releases or updates in an email to the relevant research manager, and they will also take that into account as well. You can also send it to the researcher. Just say, hey, look, we've an update on matter number 3 in the submission. We've got a decision on our appeal or something like that, and just so you know that we've won this case. So yes, you're more than welcome to get in touch with the relevant research manager or researcher and let them know about updates to work highlights. And in terms of the RMT, yes, I appreciate there's been a lot of issues initially. We are working hard to make sure that these are rectified as soon as possible. If there are instances where you're not particularly happy with the response from the customer success team or that side of things, do get in touch with the head of research for the relevant guide or research manager, and we'll most certainly look into why that's the case. But yes, we do acknowledge that in the past it hasn't been as perhaps as great as we'd like it to be, and we are continually working on it. But yeah, any instances where there are issues on your end, either with the product or with the customer success or whoever you've been dealing with, do get in touch with the research team, and we will go from there.
Thank you.
Jorge.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Ian, for the presentation. Very interesting. I have a question with respect to the weight that is given to the price of transactions. In comparing mid-market M&A with large deals, the impression that I have is that the price is taken into consideration to determine the complexity or the relevance of the case. And I'm not really sure that that's the case in all the instances. So what's the approach that you take in deciding what matter is relevant and which one is not when it comes to price?
Sure, that's a great question. So again, this will vary guide by guide. So I'd recommend getting in touch with the head of the specific guide to elaborate. But from my perspective, the value of a matter is certainly important. So as I say, in a previous life, I was in charge of corporate M&A in the USA guide, and in practice areas such as New York, we would have 2 types of tables, so elite and highly regarded. So for the elite, we would focus on multi-billion-dollar transactions, whereas highly regarded would be much more mid-market. So in specific instances, it can affect which table or which sub-table a firm appears in. But it's not the be all or end all. So with regards to transactions again, this is specific to the USA team, there is often a hierarchy of transactions. So for example, if a firm represented a buyer over a seller, then in our eyes, that's slightly better. Whereas if a firm, say, advised on a merger, that's better than, say, a smaller spin out, for example. So again, there's no exact science, but in terms of value in itself, it is a significant part of it. And for many tables, the higher the value, the better the deal is. But that's not to say that we won't also consider the type of deal that's being undertaken. But yes, please do also get in touch with the relevant local guide, and they'll be able to provide more information as to the specifics of what comes where and what's considered, top of the tree, and what's perhaps a bit more further down the hierarchy.
Thank you.
Bien, thanks. I am conscious of time. We've got about 8 minutes left. Bien, did you have a part 3 of your presentation that you wanted to go over, or we could just use the remaining time to take questions?
Sure. No, the final element is just the FAQs. There's a few FAQs that, or common FAQs that I had answers to. So I can quickly go over that after Debbie
Perfect.
and Paula's questions or any other further questions. That's fine.
Why don't we'll take Debbie's question and then we'll go back to you and then we'll come back to Paula. So Debbie, I see that you've got your hand raised.
Yes, thanks, Hannah. Hi, Vian. Sorry, just apologize. I won't probably put my camera on because it's nighttime in Singapore and I probably don't look my best after a whole day of work. Okay, so my question relates really to interview process. So obviously in Singapore, we work on I manage the team of marketing and comms in my firm Wong Partnership. So we try to get interviews with chambers on the Asia Pacific team every year for various practices, but we realized that so we try to contact the researcher the minute we know a certain researcher is assigned to a practice area to ensure that we can request an interview time with our practice group heads and lawyers. But we realize often, quite often these days, that they are not granting us these interviews. They would sort of tell us, we know you put in a good submission. We don't need to hear about your practice anymore. And basically, we don't get a chance to speak to them, which obviously would work in our favor as well. I just want to check if there is a certain guideline that chambers uses to decide which one to talk to for each practice area every year. Yeah, and is there a way we can work around it such that we can try to get these time slots with the researchers as much as possible? Yeah.
Sure. No, thanks, David. There isn't. We essentially choose a random cross section of firms that are ranked in that table and firms that are newly submitting. So if it's an instance where you'd like to be considered, I would reach out to the research manager in charge instead of the researcher and let them know that we've been keen to speak to the researcher about the practice area. We haven't been chosen over the last few cycles, but we'd most certainly be keen to speak this year around about our practice. We've got a lot of new developments and changes we'd like to highlight, and they should be able to accommodate. So my advice would be to get in touch with the research manager and go from there.
I see. And that would be known. We should be able to find the research manager's name on the website.
Yes. So so on the schedule, they should also mention that. But if any instances where you can't find the research manager, get in touch with the head. So Sarah Kogan, she's in charge of Asia, and she'll be able to pass on the email to the relevant research manager.
Understand. All right. Thanks, Vian. I appreciate it.
No problem.
All right, Bien, why don't you wrap us up,
Sure.
and then we'll come back to any questions that we have.
Okay, no problem. Let me just go to so yes, FAQ. So sorry, got one too quick. 4 main questions here that we receive a lot across the board. So I'll quickly answer these and then move on to Paula's question. So first one is, can I get an extension? In short, Chambers doesn't officially grant extensions. but you will still be able to upload the documents after the deadline has passed. If you're in an instance where you're struggling for time, my advice would be to get the referee spreadsheet up as soon as possible, since that takes some time to process on our end. And often is the case that the submission could come at a later date, a few days later after deadline. From my perspective, that's perfectly fine. But officially, we don't grant extensions, but do get in touch with the relevant head of to let them know that you're struggling with the deadline. That you don't extend. Oh, sorry. That Chambers doesn't provide extensions, but you should be able to upload after deadline, shortly after deadline. Sorry. So that's that first one. Second one, feedback received after a section has been completed. We won't take feedback on board after a section is completed for the rankings. That's essentially because the researcher has moved on to another section and the section has been finalized. We will, however, add it to our system so that feedback will be there in terms of the foundation of feedback for next year's research, and we'll obviously apply any applicable quotes to the editorial as well. But in terms of a ranking decision, any feedback that is received after the deadline will not be taken into account. Third FAQ, does Chambers accept unsolicited feedback? Again, no, we won't take on board feedback that comes directly from the client without us reaching out. So if you have an instance where the client again can't find the email but would like to provide feedback, either ask the researcher to get in touch again or forward on the email that you receive from the client to the researcher, and then the researcher will go from there to either send a survey link or arrange a call and collect feedback that way. But we won't accept unsolicited feedback. Finally, when will I find out if our firm is ranked? So with regards to this, once the research for the guide as a whole has been completed, so for global guide, it will be in October. Shortly after that, you'll get an email notification from our team saying that their practice is recognized in this table. You won't receive any information about the specific ranking. That will come out 2 weeks before the actual guide is released as embargoed rankings. So you'll find out whether the practice is ranked shortly after research is finished, and you'll find out where the practice or individual is ranked shortly before the guide is launched. Okay, so those are some frequent questions. We still got a few minutes left, so Paula, I can answer any final questions that you might have.
Thank you. It's just a very quick question regarding to something you mentioned before. You said it's better for firms to showcase a lot of lawyers so that we can showcase our bench. But if we are trying to be strategic regarding the lawyers we want to Chambers to take into account for ranking purposes, shouldn't we try to showcase the lawyers that we want to be included up for rankings, or how do we manage that strategy?
Yes, so again, there's no exact science. So for example, from my perspective, what constitutes a strong bench, I'd say, depending on the practice area, maybe 3 or 4 lawyers involved in a specific practice area. And with regards to that, if you want to highlight a very specific lawyer's work in this area, then you can allocate, say, 4 or 5 work highlights for that specific lawyer. So again, there's no exact science behind it, and it's essentially up to the practice. But I'd say, from my perspective, I'd look at minimum 2 or 3 highlights for an individual that I'm looking to move up. But again, that will vary from section to section and guide to guide. But yeah, sorry, I appreciate that hasn't really answered your question, but yeah, it's a starting point, I suppose.
Thank you.
Okay.
We are at 8 o'clock. Do we have any other questions? If we wanted to stay on for another 5 minutes. And of course, if you think after, if you think of any after the fact, also please email me. Sure. I'm happy to reach out to you. And I see, Mia, you have your hand raised.
Hi. So thank you so much for doing this. My question is regarding rankings. I'm not sure if it qualifies to be asked in this session, but a lot of times what happens is after reaching a band, the practice area rankings do not move up. So is there any suggestion for those scenarios when the rankings or whether the practice rankings or the individual rankings are stuck at a band and not moving up?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in short, that could be a number of reasons as to why that's the case. It might be that the practice or individual isn't receiving enough market recognition to move up. Perhaps they're not seen as on level with the individuals or firms above them in a band. It might be a case where the transactions, if it's a transactional matters or transactional section, aren't perhaps on the same level as those in bands above them, perhaps in terms of volume or in terms of depth and breadth when it comes to clients. Essentially, there's a number of reasons as to why that could be the case. We do have insight reports. I think a couple of you mentioned them earlier on, and those essentially, well, as the name suggests, provides insight as to the rankings, as to why the firm is ranked and how it compares to other firms in the practice area or in the table. So that's one avenue to think about, or one avenue to go down in terms of how you can perhaps move up. You would also get in touch with the research manager. They may be able to share some limited thoughts on what's holding the practice or individual back, and yeah, essentially go from there. But in short, it could be any number of reasons, really.
Thank you. Thank you.
Daniela.
I'll be short, I promise. It's just a very specific one. On the band one, for the obvious reasons, we find that it's the hardest push from band 2 to 1. You can see a faster progression either at the practice level or the individual level on other bands, and then there is the added difficulty to get to band 1. At the individual level, is there any sort of minimum that Chambers wants, either in, I don't know, age or number of years in practice or number of years as a partner? Is there anything that you have as a sort of a minimum Olympic for the band 1?
For band, no, essentially no. There will obviously need to be a partner if it's in the table where all the senior partners are in band 1. But it's there are many cases where quote unquote younger lawyers, perhaps in their 40s, late 40s, have attained band 1 recognition, and that's off the back of the work that they're doing and the market recognition primarily. So other firms are saying, this person is a band 1 lawyer, even though he's quite young, you should put him into band 1. So in short, there's no sort of barrier there. Anyone of any age can be ranked there. I think the only one that comes to mind is the up and coming ranking. So up and comers tend to be around 40 or younger. Any older than that, we will consider them for a ranking a numerical ranking in the main bands, and they tend to be ranked as up and comers for normally a maximum of 2 years. So after 2 years, we'd expect them to enter the numerical bands. Yeah, that's the only one that essentially comes to mind. But in terms of numerical rankings, there isn't a sort of minimum age limit.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, very last one, and it's not really a question.
Sure.
It's more like a comment. We did say, I would say comment / critic. I suppose I'm talking for Portugal, but that's quite widespread, that Chambers does have some, I would say, take its time to recognize the younger generation. You end up having on band 1s, and at times even on band 2, but surely in band 1s, kind of a lot of gray hair. And on top of that, you do see a lot of gender imbalance. Is there anything that Chambers is actively doing to counter that, both on the gender aspect as well as on recognition of the younger generation that are actually the ones doing most of the work?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And yeah, we fully appreciate that. Perhaps in the past years, the gender imbalance has been something that, historically that we haven't paid as much attention to as we should have. But this is something that we're actively looking into these days. So one avenue that we're trying to address that imbalance is by getting more female partners on the lawyer calls. Or perhaps minority partners on the lawyer calls, so that they can have an opportunity to talk about their practice, their skills, and their clients, and so on. And essentially, we're also paying more attention to those individuals as well when it comes to the rankings. So we're keeping a keen eye out for their commentary, work highlights, and market recognition. In terms of your first comment about the silver-haired lawyers and so on. Yes, again, we do appreciate perhaps, in previous years, a bit slow to get up to date with the market. That's something, especially on the USA guide and my guide side of things, that we've been keen to address, and we've started to take more seriously, or started to consider more when it comes to the younger lawyers. If you have specific thoughts on the Portuguese or European tables, I'd recommend getting in touch with Marlena, Herman, or Kate Reed to just say, hey, we think that the people ranked here across the board, not just at our firm, perhaps aren't the ones who should be recognized, just so just so that you're aware. And of course, they will look at that with a bit more detail as it goes on. Yes, we certainly are looking at both of those as we continue to improve our offering. I can see there's one more question. I do have a call, and that should have started 8 minutes ago, but Victoria, I'll quickly take your question, and Hannah, you can perhaps send over any questions afterwards, and I'll address those.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. I have just a quick question. How quickly a firm can move from being a band 2 to a band 1 firm? I do not know the Chambers and Partners criteria for this.
Yeah, so again, there isn't a necessary criteria here. So it can happen in one go if the feedback and evidence suggests it. So if we rank a firm in band 2 newly last year, and then we go again this year, peers are saying they're actually band 1, they've taken on loads of lawyers from XYZ, the client commentary is great, and the work highlights all in line with a leading practice, then there's no reason as to why that firm can't be band 1. Similarly, in more established tables, such as say New York M&A, we appreciate that it's a much more competitive table, so it might take a bit longer to move up the table. So in short, it depends on the section, it depends on the level of commentary that we're receiving, what the market is saying, and the level of work highlights in the submissions. But in short, it could be 1 year, 2 years maybe, or it could take a bit longer, depending on the situation.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Bien, I appreciate you coming on. We all appreciate you coming on today, and thank you for staying 10 minutes over to get our questions answered. I know you guys may have more questions, but Bien, we will let you head to your next call. And if we have any questions, I'll just send you an email, Bien, and we can get them answered that way.
Absolutely. No, it's been a pleasure connecting with you all today, and hopefully this has provided a bit more insight as to what we look into when it comes to rankings and some of the things that you can do in terms of aiding the push, in terms of getting ranking or moving up in our tables. And yes, more than happy to answer any other follow-up questions. So please feel free to reach out to me directly. My email address is my name, first name dot second name @chambers.com, or send them via Hannah. And yeah, I'll be more than happy to address those. But it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Bien.
And for everyone else on the call, thank you all for joining today and coming with all of your questions. As I said, if there are questions that were not answered, I know that I have a few here from folks that emailed in that I'll follow up with Bien on. Please send those to me, and I'll also share his email address in the follow-up email for this. I know part 2 of this was going to be a conversation with you guys about sort of best practices internally when it comes to managing referees, that sort of thing. which I think that we could spend maybe 15 to 20 minutes on the May meeting, Ignacio, continuing that discussion if that's something that we thought would be useful.
Yeah, we can certainly do that in the next meeting.
Okay, and I think we've got that on the calendar. Let me just pull up. I apologize, I've been out of commission for a few days, but it looks like our next meeting, I think, is May 10th. So we can continue that conversation then. But again, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you all showing up, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.